that time, a lot of refugees coming over here because of the war between China and Japan and civil war in China. The Chinese came here to make money to support the family at home. They are what we call sojourners. Corvallis at that time was almost like a state capital of Oregon. It was a center for Southern Oregon Railroad. They came here even before the state of Oregon admitted into the Union in 1859.
We suspect that most of the Chinese that ended up settling in Corvallis were here because of work on the Oregon and Pacific Railroad.
The Chinese were seen as being a very industrious, very obedient, and very able to do the job as the boss tells you to do.
Once in Corvallis, some of them did go to work for the railroad here, but the others worked in town. And most of them lived on 2nd Street. They lived together, multiple families. Many of them worked as house servants and cooks for families in private homes. A number of others worked as hotel cooks, or they washed dishes in hotels. But there were also those that were farm laborers, and even some that worked at the local brickyard. One of the most common occupations was that of owning a Chinese laundry. In the 1870s, the main part of downtown extended from Monroe to Jefferson Streets. That's a distance of only about 2 blocks that formed the actual heart of downtown. And that's where your brick buildings were primarily located. From north and south of that location were a number of buildings that served as more the industrial area of town. Blacksmith shops were located in South Corvallis. In North Corvallis, there was housing interspersed with older hotels, that type of thing. Those were the more marginal sections of downtown when you went north and south. In that area were wood frame buildings of previous businesses. For instance, in South Corvallis, there was a brewery building. It was located where the current post office building is in Corvallis today. That brewery building was later occupied by a Chinese laundry long after it had served its purpose as a brewery. And then on the north side of town, there was also a Chinese laundry. And so they seemed to be housed in buildings that had been successful businesses of white occupants, but as they became more run down, those seemed to be the buildings that the Chinese ended up living in. They would have their businesses and their living quarters all in one building. I do know there was some animosity toward the Chinese here, and I'm sure it was somewhat on an individual basis. Perhaps their relationship was not so bad with the people who they worked for. However, there was a little bit of tension because the Chinese were known to have opium dens in town, and the opium dens sometimes were actually frequented by some of the white women in town. And this caused quite a bit of conflict between the white population and the Chinese. There were numerous arrests made at the opium dens. So that caused some problems. And I also know that a job in a kitchen was a common job, or working in a hotel. At a certain point in town, there were advertisements that stated no Chinese employed in our kitchens. And so clearly there was a point, and that's about sometime in the 1890s, that was a prevalent feeling in town. However, in the early 1920s, when the Hotel Benton was built, we know that the Hotel Benton employed a number of Chinese in their kitchens, and they were actually housed in the basement of the hotel. I know that Chinese were employed at the Julian Hotel, which is still standing. And so clearly the feelings changed through time.
Yeah, because the future of the Chinese reflect the American way of dealing with immigrants. And that really saying a lot more about America than about the Chinese.
When the devil wants to hold you in her arms, you just might find yourself alone, horseback in the dark, driving all across those deserts.